Hello, Dr. Fernandez. I hope you are doing well. This is Kiera Warren, and I will be doing a presentation on the critical evaluation of the psychometric properties of profiling in forensic psychology. So let's go ahead and get started. So in this presentation, we will be discussing and defining forensic profiling, as well as examining four current profiling methods, and then we will lastly evaluate the ethical, cultural, and societal issues within forensic profiling. So let's first look at the definition of forensic profiling in the four primary approaches of forensic profiling. Forensic profiling was defined by Torres as the process of limits of using behavioral evidence based on a crime scene to make inferences about personality characteristics and psychopathology. And the four primary approaches were typological profiling, geographic profiling, behavioral evidence analysis, and accusatorial or statistical profiling. And I think from watching shows like CSI, Law and Order, we see so many fictitious versions of what forensic profiling actually is in forensic psychology. And so it was actually really cool to learn about what are the primary approaches, because on TV it looks very glamorized and easy and fast, but in reality, that's not what it is. So let's first move on to talk about some famous historic cases of forensic profiling. So first, I would like to talk about Adolf Hitler, who was studied, and the forensic profile for Hitler was created by psychiatrist William Langer. So William Langer was able to draw inferences about Hitler that helped in the investigation in trying to capture Hitler, and really try, I think a lot of times with forensic profiling, the whole point of it is to get into the mind of the offender, to be able to see what the offender is doing and be able to explain it. In helps of this is in help to find answers within an investigation and get justice. Now, Langer, he was able to create a psychological profile for Hitler, and some things that he identified in Hitler's psychological profile were Hitler's early life. So Langer, he highlighted the traumatic experiences and complex relationship that Hitler had with his parents, particularly his father, contributed to Hitler's psychological development. Now, within this, Langer was able to identify certain traits within Hitler, such as narcissism and megalomania, paranoia. He was able to make inferences about Hitler's sexuality. He was able to infer that Hitler possessed obsessive compulsive traits. And this is really important because in forensic profiling, I would say when we go back to the root of psychology of understanding human behavior, this was very crucial in understanding a criminal mastermind such as Hitler. Now, when it came to the prediction of Hitler's future behavior, Langer was able to predict Hitler's possible reactions to defeat. And he actually predicted correctly that Hitler would not surrender peacefully, that he would commit suicide, which he was actually correct. So, with these inferences drawn about Hitler's psychological profile, Langer was able to make predictions about future behavior, which is very vital in crime investigations, because you're able to determine, or maybe even not determine, but you're able to make a notion or a guess about an offender's next move when you're trying to solve the crime or when you're trying to understand this criminal. Now, with Hitler, the influence of the psychoanalytic behavior that Langer was able to identify in Hitler, he used the Freudian framework, which was very popular at the time. And with this, he was able to interpret that much of Hitler's behavior stemmed from childhood traumas, repressed sexual urges, and a deep inferiority complex. And he also noted that Hitler possessed the Oedipus complex. So he suggested that Hitler's domineering father and close attachment to his mother played key roles in shaping his personality. And he theorized that Hitler's hatred of his father may have transferred onto other authority figures and later to entire racial or political groups. And within this, if we go over to psychiatrist David Brussel, who was the second most famous case of forensic profiling of the New York mad bomber George Metasky. Brussel, his use of psychological analysis to create a detailed profile of the bomber demonstrated the power of profiling in helping law enforcement narrow down suspects. And it was also a forensic psychology milestone because the Mad Bomber case, it was widely regarded as one of the first successful uses of criminal profiling in a major criminal case. And Brussel, he used a combination of behavioral clues. So the way the bombs were made, the method of communication, and psychological insight to generate this profile that he created of the Mad Bomber. And I think the most important thing about David Brussel was the accuracy of the criminal profile that he created. And it was particularly related to the prediction that Metasky would be wearing a double-breasted suit. And he was correct. So when we look at these two famous historic forensic profiles, because these are forensic profiles of individuals that we learn about and we hear about, and these are some of the two most notorious criminals still today, we're able to understand and make inferences about their behavior, but also understand why it is important to look at everything in an individual's life, including their behavior, but also extrinsic motivators and extrinsic factors into why they are the way they are, which can help a lot in efforts of criminal justice, to obtain justice when you are studying individuals who are criminals and offenders. Now, the first type of forensic profiling we're going to talk about is typological profiling. And it's a method used in forensic psychologies and investigations to classify offenders into categories or types based on their behavioral patterns at the crime scene. The aim of this type of profiling is to be able to draw inferences of offenders' personality, motivations, and it's likely based on behaviors at the crime scene. And if you have the behavioral classification, then you have the organized versus disorganized typology, which is widely used in FBI investigations today, and also being able to draw inferences off their personality and motive. Now, the organized versus disorganized typology, it defines it as organized offenders. They display control and planning at the crime scene versus disorganized offenders who they act impulsively or emotionally, leaving chaotic and unplanned crime scene. In these classifications, it helps narrow down suspects and understand the offender's psychological state. And it's often drawn on psychological theories that link personality traits with the type of crime scene presented. And the profilers use this information to hypothesize about the offender's motive. And it's a widely common use in the FBI in forensic profiling. The next type of forensic profiling we're going to discuss is geographic profiling, which it has 4 core concepts within it. But geographic profiling, it's an investigative technique that is used to determine the like area of residence or base of operations for a serial offender by analyzing the locations of their crimes. So this method, it actually assumes that offenders commit crimes in areas where they are familiar with, often near their homes or places of work. And the geographic profiling, it uses data points from crime locations like crime scenes, body dump sites, or where victims were to create a map of possible areas where the offender may live or frequent. Now, crime site analysis, this core concept within geographic profiling, underpins geographic profiling and suggests that operation within a limited spatial area based on their routine activity at home or at work or their leisure spots. And the criminals, it says that criminals tend to commit offenses in where they feel comfortable or knowledgeable, but far enough still from their home to avoid immediate detection. The core concept of routine activity theory explains that the frequency of crimes further from, the routine activity theory basically honing in on a criminal's routine activity to determine where they're going, what's their next crime they're committing, and why they're committing these crimes. While distance decay, it holds that the frequency of crimes happens based on the further an offender is from their home. And lastly, we have the journey to crime core concept within geographic profiling, which states that offenders are less likely to commit crimes in neighborhoods for fear of being recognized, but they commit the offenses within a reasonable distance from their home. And the journey to the crimes helps pinpoint a buffer zone to be able to speculate suspects. And there are multiple tools used in geographic profiling, such as Rasmo's formula, CrimeSnap, and Dragnet. Now, behavioral analysis has 4 steps to it: the equivocal forensic analysis, the forensic victimology, crime scene characteristics, and offender traits identification. Now, first, it can be described as a deductive profiling method that is used in forensic investigations to understand criminal behavior based on physical and behavioral evidence from crime scenes. And this technique is actually case-based and focuses on analyzing specific aspects of an offender's actions during the crime to identify key psychological and behavioral traits. Now, the first step, which is equivocal forensic analysis, it examines physical evidence to determine the behavior of the offender during the crime. Next, we have forensic victimology. In this aspect of it, studies the role of the victim to understand why they were targeted, and also this helps assess the offender selection process. Now, third, we have crime scene characteristics, which they identify how the crime was committed, including the patterns or unique signatures left by the perpetrator. And lastly, there is offender traits identification, which uses the previously collected data to profile the suspect's personality and behavioral tendencies. And this is a very, very common form of forensic profiling that is used heavily today, one of the most famous out of the 4, because of the success that it yields and the viability of this method to actually be able to be applied and be reliable in criminal investigations for profilers. Now we have actuarial statistical profiling, and it is the data-driven, and it incorporates data-driven analysis, risk factors and variables, actuarial tools, probability-based predictions, and objective approaches. Now, it is a method used in criminal justice and forensic psychology that applies statistical models to predict criminal behavior or outcomes based on the analysis of large data set. And this approach actually differs from the traditional profiling techniques as we previously discussed, such as behavioral evidence analysis or geographical profiling, because it relies on empirical data and quantifiable risk factors rather than psychological insights or crime scene details. And one of the main, there have been multiple tools developed for actuarial profiling, but the main advantage of using this kind of profiling is the objective being based on statistical models and large data sets, and it avoids subjective biases that may be harmful to the reliability and viability of the profile created. And there are several. I could go all day listing them. I could go all day talking about each of these in more depth, but actuarial statistical profiling is actually the second most commonly used type of profiling today, next to the behavioral evidence analysis. But all of these approaches, they can be used within a combination to help gain a full picture in forensic profiling that helps profilers be able to effectively profile an individual. So the psychometric properties we're going to talk about in relation to criminal profiling or forensic profiling is reliability, validity, and standardization. So forensic profiling, it raises important questions regarding these 3 psychometric properties because each of these factors are crucial for the method to be used effectively in criminal investigations and also court proceedings. And just to recap, so we know what these psychometric properties actually mean, reliability refers to the consistency of a method or tool when applied repeatedly under similar conditions. And in forensic profiling, it's important because it means when different profilers or the same profiler are conducting these profiles at different times, they can produce similar profiles given the crime scene evidence. Now, validity refers to how well a method measures what it is supposed to measure. And in profiling, this means whether the generated profile accurately predicts the characteristics of the actual offender. And with standardization, it refers to the creation of uniform procedures that forensic profiling methods are applied consistently across cases and practitioners. Now, with each of these three key psychometric properties, there are challenges presented, such as with reliability, the subjective nature of the profiling methods. Some of them, for example, typological profiling, they can lead to variations in outcomes based on the profiler's experience or interpretation of the evidence. And studies have shown that the generated information by the different experts can sometimes diverge significantly. Now, with validity, the challenge is that one of the primary concerns, they may lack empirical validity, because many profiling approaches, they particularly contain early versions of criminal profiling that are criticized or have been criticized for not being scientifically validated, which is why the profiling method of actuarial or statistical profiling is so important, because it bases its profiling in empirical data, which is a common theme that allows for the validity of the method to be received. And with standardization, the challenge is that profiling, especially in its early forms, has been critiqued for lacking a standardized method. And this lack of standardized methodology, it has formalized protocols, meaning that different investigators might employ various methods and assumptions, resulting in inconsistent profiles. Now, there are solutions to this, because one, recent developments have aimed to actually combine actuarial models with traditional profiling methods to create a more balanced approach. And this hybrid model seeks to capitalize on the standardization and statistical rigor of actuarial methods while maintaining the behavioral insights gained from psychological and behavioral evidence. And they can also be combated by using actuarial profiling to addressing validity and addressing reliability, because empirical data is such an important aspect of it that when we critically evaluate the psychometric properties of profiling methods, they're not only enhancing the scientific rigor behind the practice, but also addressing legal and ethical concerns. And in real-world forensic cases, poor profiling can lead to serious consequences, including wrongful conviction. So this presentation was to aim that there are issues there are issues within criminal forensic profiling that can be addressed, but we must look at the type of approaches being used and take those approaches and go through each and examine the psychometric properties within each, so that we can move forward and better enhance these criminal profiling methods, because crime does not stop. And this has been an added and very emphasized important tool when you are able to use these profiling examples and even hone in on maybe preventing crime, or resource allocation to know for criminal justice departments to know where should they allocate their resources to when investigating crime or to preventing crime. So thank you very much, Dr. Fernandez. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. This was my first presentation in years, and it was actually very pleasant, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye. Here are my references as well. Thank you.